you, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Salem. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the director of the Hudson Valley Food System Coalition and a member of the Accountability Council for Glynwood's Food Sovereignty Fund. The Hudson Valley Food System Coalition is a transdisciplinary regional coalition that works across the 9-county region of the Hudson Valley in New York, which is located just an hour north of New York City, an hour south of Albany, or within that radius. And we work to do that by connecting across sector collaboration, influencing different policy, and instigating transformational change within community by leveraging our network. And I'm excited to be here, and I will pass to Christine Hutchinson.
Thank you, Salem. Hi, I'm Christine Hutchinson. I'm also in the Hudson Valley, Newburgh, New York. My professional background is in education, and I taught in the Newburgh School District for 19 years. My passion background is in food, all things food and food access. And those things have melded into some of the work that I do with Our Core, which is a hyper-local organization that works with youth in a few different capacities, including agricultural education. And I am a recent transplant into the work world at NEFO, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And that is a land trust that works to provide land access for BIPOC land stewards, not just farmers, but land stewards of different types. I use she and her as my pronouns, and I'm happy to be here to talk about this awesome work that we have done together with the Food Sovereignty Fund.
Great, thank you, both of you. So as you can tell, all three of us work together on the Food Sovereignty Fund, which is housed under Glynwood's work, our regional food programs, but could not be possible without our Accountability Council, the many farms that we work with, as well as the food access partners. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the presentation. All right, does that look good to everyone? Great. All right, so to start, I just wanted to outline that obviously for this sort of work, we need to work in community. We need everyone on board to tackle the problem, and collaboration and communication with a wide variety of people and organizations we found creates the most enduring and effective work. And also creating an ecosystem, identifying the individual organisms that will do the process to sustain the ecosystem will result in a self-sustaining food system that can operate for many, many years to come. So I wanted to start by defining food sovereignty. What does food sovereignty even mean? There are a lot of terms that people use in this world, including food insecurity and food access. But we really believe that food sovereignty takes it one step further and is really powerful in its meaning. So you can see the slide here, but I'm going to read it aloud as well. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. So we keep this definition in mind with every action that we take within the Food Sovereignty Fund. And I would say that food sovereignty is a goal of our program. I don't think that we've necessarily achieved it. There's still so much to be done within our region, within our country, and our world to make sure that everyone has the food that they deserve and they want. But we really do, we're proud of the impact that this program has had in the past 3 years. So the purpose of the Food Sovereignty Fund in broad strokes is to empower Hudson Valley farmers to partner with community-led food access projects in order to make delicious, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food grown by regional farmers available to people who otherwise may not have access. And this is how the Food Sovereignty Fund came about. I'm sure that most of you know that even prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of fissures in our national food system as well as in our regional food systems. Farms have paper-thin profit margins, and there are also many barriers for lots of people trying to enter the sustainable farming scene, but particularly for people who identify as BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and women. As far as hunger relief and food access goes in this country, it has historically relied on waste and donations from large agribusiness and corporate food systems, making it really hard to integrate fresh, regionally grown food. And also it relies on volunteer labor such that we don't have that extra lift that we need to bring food workers and farmers together to get food where it needs to be. And finally, in terms of workforce and infrastructure development, there's been a lack of coordination and communication, an overly centralized distribution system, which also means that if one part of that system shuts down, then it impacts an astronomical number of people. And the result of this, of course, is unequal distribution in resources, opportunities, and outcomes caused by systemic oppression. Once the COVID crisis hit in the Hudson Valley, we saw a lot of additional impacts. We saw that farmers were desperate to donate as much of their locally produced food as they could, but also had a bottom line to maintain and were worried about some of the wholesale accounts that they were losing. And on the flip side, they were gaining accounts for people really desperate to ensure that they were getting the food that they needed. So they were seeing sky-high CSA sales, farmers market sales, et cetera. We saw unprecedented need in the hunger relief and food access sector. But with that, there was an inconsistent supply of fresh food or local food for hunger relief, an exponential increase in food insecurity, and everyone was strapped far too thin to accommodate all of the needs they were seeing in their communities. And within the workforce and infrastructure sector, there was record high unemployment, particularly in the food service sector as restaurants shut down, and also insufficient and broken distribution infrastructure, which we have continued to see during global supply chain disruptions, among other things. And the big result of all of these factors was, once again, unequal distribution in resources, opportunities, and outcomes caused by systemic oppression, which was further exacerbated by a global crisis. So during the shutdown in spring 2020, Glynwood and many other regional farmers and food access partners and nonprofits began having conversations about what we could do. We knew that we needed to do something to support our community and to feed everyone within the Hudson Valley region, particularly those suffering from food insecurity. And we wanted to figure out collectively how to do it and to build our strengths together rather than have too much redundancy in our programs. So we had a lot of community calls via Zoom. Salem and Christine and my colleague Megan, who's also on this call, were all part of that. And through that, we first started by forming an accountability council full of people who are farmers and food access partners and nonprofit managers in the region, the vast majority of whom identify as BIPOC, LGBTQ and or women, to start to form a program, which we decided to call the Food Sovereignty Fund. And we identified the goals of the Food Sovereignty Fund as the following: to advance food sovereignty in the Hudson Valley, to ensure that every Hudson Valley resident, regardless of zip code, can access farm fresh, locally produced food during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, to fairly compensate local BIPOC, LGBTQ, female identifying farmers for growing food for hunger relief, to transform the emergency feeding system in the region by increasing support of and accountability to small-scale farmers, grassroots hunger relief efforts, and the people that they feed, and to strategically integrate regional food systems efforts with hunger relief efforts catalyzed by COVID-19, but mobilized to maintain momentum post-crisis. So this is a little bit about how the Food Sovereignty Fund works on the ground. So we have recruited farms for 3 years now to participate in the Food Sovereignty Fund, and also farms reach out to us to express their own independent interest. And we form a contract with each of those farms in advance of the growing season based on their ability to fulfill the contract and their interest in the program and passion for food sovereignty. And we work with that farm to match them to an appropriate food access partner. Some of them already have existing relationships with a food pantry in their community, maybe down the street from their farm, but some of them may need help finding that food access partner, which we can do by looking geographically, but also thinking about what distribution routes they already have for things like CSA drop-off or farmers markets, and find the right fit. Each farm receives partnership support in their preferred language. We work with several farmers who are predominantly Spanish speaking and have done a lot of work in language justice to make sure that they have documents and also in-person events and presentations that are in their preferred language, which we can talk about a bit more later. We have an annual evaluation process as well, which includes reflection and feedback from both the farms and the food access partners. So we hear their individual perspectives on how the relationship went, and with partner managers to see whether they want to continue that relationship for another year, and if so, how they want to improve things even more. On that note, each farm and food access project match has a partnership manager that checks in over the course of the season and makes sure that everything is going smoothly, make sure that the food is being received when they're expecting it, also that farmers are keeping up with their invoices and sending us those invoices so that we can do record keeping and make sure that all the farms are on the right track to fulfilling their agreed upon contract. The food access program also tracks those invoices so that we're all on the same page. And finally, everyone participates in an end of year evaluation process, like I mentioned previously, so that we can make sure that the program was mutually beneficial to the food access program and to the farm, as well as to the consumers, the eaters who are accessing food via that food access program. And now that COVID feels a little bit more under control, we've also had several in-person gatherings so that everyone can meet each other, because we are in community with each other and we have a regional identity and a sense of pride with this program. And we want to have fun. We want to share food and just meet each other on personal levels. So that's been a really important and powerful aspect of this program too. So just a bit of background on how the program has grown over the past season. As I mentioned previously, in 2020, we started with more than 30 meetings with farmers and food access workers, which ultimately led to the formation of the Accountability Council. And that council agreed to form the Food Sovereignty Fund. It was through those collective visioning sessions that we came to this conclusion that this is what our region needed. That first season, we raised about $17,000 to contract 10 farms to grow food specifically for these food access partners. Of those 10 farms, 3 were led by BIPOC farmers, 4 by LGBTQ+ farmers, and 5 by female identifying farmers. The next year, As you can see, our program grew by a lot. We went suddenly from $17,000 worth of contracts to over $150,000. And that has a lot to do with people hearing about our story and reaching out to us directly to say that they wanted to support this work. And the word got out to farmers too. So 37 farms expressed interest, and we were able to add 7 additional farms for a total of 17 contracted farms in 2021. 15 led by BIPOC farmers, 5 by LGBTQ+ farmers, 10 by female identifying farmers, and 7 immigrant-owned farms. And one of the reasons why our total contract amount increased that much is because we partnered with ECNY, which you see on that slide, which stands for Episcopal Charities of New York. They had already been looking for ways to increase the flow of regional food going into their church-affiliated pantries. And they heard about the Food Sovereignty Fund through all of our storytelling. We were publishing blogs, we were joining community calls, putting it on social media. And so they reached out to us and expressed interest in supporting this work, and specifically in matching some of our farms to Episcopal Charity of New York affiliated pantries. And that relationship has been really successful, and we're glad to be continuing with it. This past season, we're still crunching some of the numbers, but I thought I'd give you a sneak preview. So 17 farms were again invited to participate in 2022, and with additional recruitment and applications, we ultimately made contracts with 22 farms, 16 run by BIPOC farmers, 5 by LGBTQ+, 11 female identifying farmers, and 7 immigrant-owned farms. These farms were paired with 20 different community-led food access partners, both in the Hudson Valley and in New York City, because as some of you may already know, the Hudson Valley is the food shed that funnels into New York City, and many of our producers are already going into New York City for CSA distribution or for the green markets. We increased the minimum contract amount per farm to $5,000 after hearing feedback from our farms that otherwise it was just too much of a logistical hassle and too little revenue to make the program as worth it as it could be. And this year we also made a rainy day fund of sorts. We set aside an additional $20,000 for unanticipated crop failures and or bumper crops. Because with climate volatility, we know that farmers are facing more crop failures than they ever have before. This year, we had a really intense drought and several heat waves in the Hudson Valley. And in the 2021 season, we had several tropical storms that flooded several farms in our program and really devastated their winter squash crops and root crops in particular. So this year, that amounted to $290,000 in contracts, and to date, that has amounted to 66,000 pounds of food. One other really exciting thing that happened this year is we started forming sub-regional hubs. So this project was anchored by Accountability Council members and local emergency feeding projects that identified that one of the big bottlenecks in the food access world is cold storage, that there is not enough cold storage infrastructure at community-run organizations to accommodate all of the fresh food that they need to feed vulnerable communities. And so this year, we established 3 pilot hubs in Dutchess and Orange counties. So one of them is at Arcor, where Christine works. One of them is at Dutchess Outreach in Poughkeepsie, New York. And one of them is at the Northeast Community Center in Millerton, New York. And all three of these organizations distribute food themselves, but also partner with other smaller pantries within their communities to further spread their reach. So all three of these hubs received refrigerated trailers where they can store fresh food, whether it's vegetables, fruit, or meat, and can coordinate with their food access partners to make sure that food gets where it needs to go. Christine, I don't know if you want to add anything, but you have probably the best perspective on this project.
I'm not sure that I have much to add, but I can speak to my experience that led me to understand the importance of these hubs. And it's that these feeding programs, these food pantries, were really built around canned goods and boxes of things. And cold storage was never really taken into account historically. Now, some of them throughout the years have added in some cold storage. Others have not been able to, and new food pantries that pop up often don't have the funding and space for cold storage. So there were many days where we would drop off boxes of produce and a feeding program would like put that stuff in front of the air conditioner and hope that it stayed cold enough to not go bad. And I personally am very upset with food waste, and I saw that all this work that we were doing to move food still resulted in some food waste. So for our hub, we're actually parking it outside of our largest feeding program, food access program partner. And that hub will provide access to other feeding programs in our area. Even if we had the means to put cold storage in some of these places, there just isn't space. So now they can come to our hub and pick up what they need to distribute when they need to distribute it, so it stays cold and safe and fresh until then. Our unit actually also turns into a freezer, which is different than the other units, because we want to long-term begin preserving produce in season so that that local high quality food is still available to folks throughout the winter. We have relatively long winters here.
Great. And Christine, would you be making value-added products like soups and that sort of thing to freeze? Would you be freezing whole vegetables, or would you be doing a combination?
Initially, it will really just be about strictly preserving the produce as it is. Through some of our other partnerships, we do support like cooked meals that are distributed to people in need, hot food that is. And we would like to be able to prepare actual foods and almost ready to eat meals that could be frozen and distributed as needed. That's a much longer term plan. Right now, we do not have access to any commercial kitchens. There's no public community commercial kitchen for rent in our county. And we've been working on establishing one, but it proves to be difficult in lining up the space and the funds and everything. So long term, I could see that happening for sure.
Great. Thanks for adding that. Salem, do you have anything you want to add?
I mean, I would just echo everything that Christine said. And I think, one of the things that this most significantly impacts is access to food, meaning, as Christine just mentioned, one of the biggest barriers that smaller food access organizations have in relationship with larger food access organizations is there's, a difference of hours available. So, whereas prior, even if you had enough refrigerated storage as a food access organization, you close at 4:30, you have another partner that may serve food after hours or during the weekend who can't then get access to the excess food that you have. So what these hubs do is open that point of access by putting themselves in a location where you just go to a trailer and enter a code and then take the food that you need, and of course log it in some way without necessarily having to impact or reach contact to the other organization. So this model really then helps to, improve that relationship between smaller food access organizations and larger food access organizations, in addition to, understanding that farmers who are going to bring food to organizations don't always necessarily, have the ability to go during business hours, whatever those may be. So again, this point of access creates just a point of aggregation for farms and a point of distribution for communities, to kind of, expand the availability of food within a community. And I really think that part of the other, value of what this pilot is doing is demonstrating, a successful implementation of a hub in a community that can then be replicated throughout the community. Knowing that, as Christine said, one of the other missing links is the ability to process foods. But I think before we get to being able to solve that issue, we have to first bring the food into community and demonstrate that there's a need, and that it's able to move around more easily. And so that's exactly, what these hubs provide.
Mm-hmm. Great point, Salem. Yeah, and on that note, you can see at the bottom of the slide here that we're hoping to expand this program in the future. We got really generous funding from an organization called the Anahata Fund to support this work. And this year we implemented 3 pilot hubs, as I mentioned, but we're going to be expanding that to 3 new pilot hubs in the 2024 season. Hopefully we will ultimately establish permanent cold storage at the 3 original hubs, and then move those more temporary cold storage trailers to 3 other hubs, such that we can provide a replicable model, because we know that if programs like this are too centralized, then they break. We saw that in the COVID pandemic, and so we actually want an iterative process in our region, so that we can work both on a regional level, but also really give individual communities agency to figure out what works best for them. Great. Well, thank you for listening. My email is on this slide. If you have any more questions, you want to talk more details about the Food Sovereignty Fund, but I want to go ahead and stop sharing so that I can see all of you again. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have any immediate questions, or you can put questions in the chat box too. Great. Well, if no one has, oh, let's see, Meredith. Yeah, can you talk more about what the Accountability Council does and what the structure looks like? Does one of you want to take that question, or do you want me to start?
I mean, I'm sure I can, if you want, I can take a stab, Kate, and then Christine and you can both kind of fill in the gaps, whatever I miss. We anticipated this question. And I mean, I said, so the form of the council is, it was developed through, the network of meetings that Kate mentioned that came to the vision of the Food Sovereignty Fund, and meant to include folks across the region who work both in farming and in food access, as well as community organizing, to create, folks who have the relationship with those other organizations, and then kind of like the insight or, the community knowledge of what the needs could be. In addition to representing, the LGBTQ plus community, the BIPOC community, and the community of women that exists in the Hudson Valley and in the food system. And so the group was formed, and each member of the group is compensated for their time. And the group first met, I think it was a bi-monthly basis, to develop the structure of the Food Sovereignty Fund and to work on suggesting, different farms and food access partners that could be engaged in the fund. I think that the decision-making process up to this point has been very democratic. However, right now, Kate and her colleagues from Glynwood, Megan, who's on the call, are working with the Accountability Council to better codify that decision-making process as well as governance of the Accountability Council itself. And so it's based on the capacity of each member, whether or not they want to be engaged. And then, there's also we suggest other people who we think would be good Accountability Council members. So we're kind of working on what contract terms might be, how other people could get involved so that it's not a stagnant body, and it is a good way to connect to communities on a more localized level. So it does create kind of a network within the region. And I know Christine can talk to how youth are engaged in the council as well.
So this is actually new. We've recently made space for youth on the council because we recognize the importance of involving youth in all of these efforts. And there are 2 seats for youth. And because it could be overwhelming or intimidating, initially they're coming in and listening and making themselves comfortable. They know that there are people that they can kind of message off to the side to ask for clarity or more information if they don't understand something. And when they are ready and feel that they're informed enough to make decisions, at that point, they can begin to engage in I'm using the term voting process very loosely because we don't vote like yay or nay. It's more just discussion and coming to conclusions. But at that point, they can say that they're ready and they want to be full council members, and they also receive a stipend for participating and just have a voice that has equal weight with everyone.
Great, thank you both. I'm just gonna put a link in the chat that directs you to our Food Sovereignty Fund program webpage on Glynwood's website, and that has a public list of our current Accountability Council. So just in conclusion, we have formed an Accountability Council that we hope is representative of the communities that we're aiming to serve. And these are really experts in our region who are going above and beyond to serve their communities. And I think one other thing that is important to note is we have several members of our Accountability Council who are farmers who are contracted through the Food Sovereignty Fund. We also have several members of the Accountability Council who are parts of food access partners that receive food through the Food Sovereignty Fund, but we also have Accountability Council members who are not involved directly in the program. They're still very much invested in this effort, but perhaps don't have personal interest in mind, but want to see this program flourish as much as it can. Any other questions about the accountability question or otherwise?
Kate, I think we had a question from Michelle in the Whova chat that I just wanted to bring to your attention. So they're wondering, if we wanted to become involved in the program, how do we begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have a questionnaire for farms. So we first and foremost reach out to farms and let them know about this opportunity. And we have an interest form, a quick survey that they can fill out that lets us know where they're located, where they're distributing food, whether who they're serving, and what sort of goal they have in joining the program. And as an Accountability Council, we review those applications in the winter and have an interview process in which Accountability Council members get on the phone with potential farm candidates. And if they're accepted into the program, then we have multiple conversations to agree upon the right contract amount, and then also to form that relationship with a food access partner. Some of them apply and say, I already have a pantry who I work with weekly. I really want to serve them more. Their level of need is greater than what I've been able to field in the past. In which case, great, we can work something out there. But also if they don't have someone in mind, then we can work with them to find the right fit. And we also have preliminary conversations with both the farmer and the food access partner in the same room to make sure that it feels like a good fit. And we walk through the standard operating procedure. You know, when is the food going to arrive? What sort of boxes is it going to be in? Who's going to meet you at the door? Is the invoice going to be printed, or are you going to email it to us beforehand? And also in the winter, they can do a little bit of crop planning together. The food access partner can indicate these are the foods that we really, really need, that our community wants. And the farmer can also indicate, you know, these are the sorts of communities for whom I'm trying to grow food. How can we work together to make sure that it gets to those communities? So that's a little bit more about how farms can participate. Oh, great. And Lindsay, thank you for your question as well. I'll just read this aloud. What is the selection process for involving folks in the council? Is it an open application for community members who would like to be members? I'm also curious if this process is different for youth members. Salem, Christine, do either of you want to take a first stab, or do you want me to go ahead?
So the process for the council selection, I think, has been kind of casual up to this point. So out of the initial meetings that we had following, you know, the height of the pandemic, people were kind of almost self-selected as who wanted to kind of engage in this work and take the vision further. And again, in addition to being self-identifying as a woman, as a part of the LGBTQ+ community or BIPOC community. And, you know, based on their insight into the food and ag issues that we had highlighted and had been even further highlighted through the pandemic. I could see there being a process of application for folks who are interested in being a part of an accountability council. However, any additional member that has been added has kind of been, you know, through word of mouth or suggestion of other accountability council members, as, you know, people who we think would help add to the work. Again, though, I could see it benefiting from a more kind of democratic process of selection for folks who are interested. And I'll let Christine talk about how the youth are involved in the council.
So the youth becoming involved came out because of just a conversation about the youth that I work with through our core. And my desire always is to bring the youth into pretty much everything that I do, just to broaden their experiences and to ensure that these things that I believe are important are passed down to the next generations. So there wasn't like an outreach process from the council. It was really me going to kids I work with and saying, so listen, I do this thing, and explaining the role of the accountability council. They were already aware of the Food Sovereignty Fund because our involvement through our core was really an extension of the work that we were doing in food access already. These kids have been growing food and donating it for a number of years. So I told them about the Accountability Council itself, what the meetings look like, purpose of it, and so on, and said, you know, we need some young representation on here. And a couple of the kids were interested, and then we talked about what might make a good fit, and we narrowed it down to one person, one young lady who actually is pursuing a career in agriculture because of the programming that she's going through. And I foresee it kind of being the same for now, just because it is a big leap to go from being a high school student to stepping into this this different system, and where nothing works the way that it does in high school. The way we speak to each other is different. It's all very different. And I think it's important to have a supported experience. So I'm there with them, and I'm a person they're very comfortable with. We have relationships that have been ongoing. And initially, I see us continuing to do this in the same way. And there is one other person who's on the council who works with youth as well. And I would expect the same thing to happen with her and her programming.
Great. Thanks, Christine. And Kitty, great question. Are there any roles for public health professionals within the org? And Salem said certainly having public health professionals could benefit the project. So Glynwood for a long time has been trying to figure out exactly how to pair regional food and public health, because there is an inextricable link, right? Food that is regionally grown, locally produced, and seasonal is more nutrient dense, and also provides more joy and more dignity to the people who are consuming it. And so we have had a lot of introductory meetings with public health professionals in the region, whether dietitians, nutritionists. There's also a really cool hospital kitchen through the New York Presbyterian hospital system that teaches people healthy cooking and also advocates for better food in the hospital system. And we know several people who are also advocating for produce prescription programs, almost like a CSA share, but it's prescribed by your doctor, subsidized if not free, and it's part of your as part of your healing process. So it hasn't been directly linked to the Food Sovereignty Fund necessarily, but Glynwood has been very involved in the link between regional food and health. And yeah, we'd love to be in touch with you. My colleague, Michelle Hughes, is the primary point person for that work. She works at Glynwood, but is also a medicinal herb farmer. And last year, she organized a 4-part virtual workshop series on regional food and health with experts from around the country. So we can be in touch about that, Kitty. Great. Okay, I see a question from Meredith. Can you speak more about the food access organizations you work with? Are they paying in part or in full for the local food, or does Glynwood? So I can start with that. So the food access organizations are a variety of different scales and models, but they are all receiving the food for free. So Glynwood is the one who is coordinating the fundraising responsible to build the contracts with farmers. A lot of these food access partners already have budget lines to purchase regional food. So for some of them, this is supplemental regional food, and they're seeking funding independently as well. But for contracts that are specifically through the Food Sovereignty Fund, the contracts are paid for by Glynwood. Do you want, so Salem and Christine both have worked at length with food access programs that are part of this project. So if you want to speak more to how they differ from one another, I think that could be great.
We definitely can. So we work with, I would say, the smallest and largest food access programs all within the city of Newburgh. And our largest program is able to really take in any types of vegetables, and distribute them, because so many people from so many different walks of life come through there. Sometimes there's a concern with certain vegetables going to a smaller food access program because the people who are patronizing it won't know what to do with it, or just don't use it for whatever reason. So we enjoy that large distribution because there's somebody who knows how to use anything that goes their way. There are smaller distributions. I would say the smallest distribution is actually our cores, and we partner with an organization for CARES and actually just set up a stand in a very high need neighborhood at a time that most feeding programs are not open. One of the difficulties that we face is all of our feeding programs, they run in the morning, really. So you have to be able to get there somewhere between 8 in the morning and 10, 11 or so, even though the distribution may continue until 12 or later. If you're not online and in process of getting your food, you can't go out after 10:30, 11 o'clock. So we actually decided to do something in the evening so that folks who are working during the day could also have access to that produce. That would be our smallest distribution, and it's really a pop-up tent and table like you would see at a farmer's market, with a variety of produce that's set up in beautiful and appealing manners, and people can come through and shop for what they need at no cost, of course. There are some others that are in between. We started supporting a program through an AME Zion church, and they actually do the old-fashioned pre-bag pantry item method, which, because I don't like waste, and because it doesn't allow for the same dignity as being able to choose your own items, I'm working with them to try to adjust their model, but basically they limit how much of each thing goes into a bag, and staff there at the pantry make the choice. That is one of the models, and it happens in a lot of places. It's not the best model, sure. During COVID, a lot of programs had to switch to a model more like that, unfortunately, but now most of them have changed back. This one just hasn't yet. We also support the program that cooks meals. So we provide fresh produce for these really wholesome, nutritious, and tasty meals as well. So those are folks we work with.
And Christine, how do you allocate food to different people within your network? Do you send everyone a list? Or now that you have the trailer, the cold storage unit, do they each have access and can take what they need? I'm curious how that has looked.
So what we started doing when we knew that the trailers were coming is kind of running through different potential models. And we settled on using a Google form so that the organizations could order what they wanted. And the idea was we practice this model, figure out the bugs, and then when the food hub comes, we just roll right into it in that way. I like that model, but we ran into some difficulty with one particular organization where there just was no technical capacity. And what that means is the work of this thing is on whatever day. For us, it was Tuesdays. We tried to get everything in on Tuesdays. So Tuesday, we go through what we have. Most of it was in line with what was ordered from the farm, but sometimes other things would come in or like substitutions were made. So we go through what we have and just put up a list of those items. And on the form, just make a checkbox next to each of the items so that the feeding program can just go in and say, oh, I know my people like these 8 things and they don't tend to care for these, or for whatever reason, we don't want that. And the idea is once we transition into the food hub and we have our racks the word's escaping me, we can kind of put those orders together on the rack so that when the feeding programs come, that's their rack. They take their stuff and then they can go, so that it's a smooth process. We have not gotten there yet, but that is the intention. We also, I anticipate that what happens now is sometimes, because people know that we're doing this, I'll get a call. I have 400 pounds of sweet potatoes or whatever on some random day. So I anticipate that kind of thing will continue to happen, and haven't figured out a way to accommodate for that in an automated way yet. So initially it'll probably be still the same system of, hey, you guys need some sweet potatoes, and calling around until everything is taken. Because of the different sizes of the programs, we just kind of adjust the amount that goes. I know AME is probably going to feed 75 families, so I adjust the amount of produce we send to meet that demand. Whereas Deacon Jack, hundreds of people are coming through, and we ensure that we send them a larger portion of what we have. Did I answer all the parts of the question?
Yeah, that was great.
Okay.
Thank you, Christine. Salem, do you have anything to add from Dutchess Outreach based on the scale that you were working at there?
Yeah, I mean, I just guess more generally, like, you know, from food pantry to food program, like what Christine described is basically, you know, the work that we had been doing mostly with smaller outside organizations, but, you know, within the organization, since Dutchess Outreach offers food in a number of different ways, and, you know, client choice model pantry to prepared meal to, you know, a mobile market kind of model. The food was kind of just being equally distributed through those programs. And I think, you know, as far as knowing that, so Dutchess Outreach is an organization that I had worked for around 7 years, and I departed there to pursue my own passion, that is food system consultant. I don't know why. Oh, just kidding. And so, you know, in that work, as the largest food access organization in the region, you know, a lot of the times, even for us, purchasing food from local farms was a challenge. However, we kind of, as an organization, made it a part of our mission to codify that relationship into our work. However, you know, what the Food Sovereignty Fund does is help to further kind of bridge the gap between farms and food access organizations for smaller organizations that work in food access, but also for larger organizations like Dutchess Outreach. So while prior our relationship with farms was more transactional, what this does is help us build a lasting relationship with local farms that, you know, deserve to have the support that they're receiving from the contracts that they get through Glynwood. And so while a lot of the times the relationship between the food access partner and the farm was purely based on almost an exploitation of, you know, excess food that was not able to sell at the market or not able to be gleaned from the fields, now we're kind of helping food access organizations change their behaviors to understanding the value of paying the farmers for the food. So, you know, while Kate mentioned a lot of food access organizations do have a budgetary line to purchase food, it's usually not that large. And you can't typically afford food grown by farmers. And so while we don't want to undercut or ask for, you know, a discounted rate, we do want to demonstrate to food access organizations that they should be fundraising to purchase this food. And why it's such a value to the community that they live in addition to being a value to actually playing a participatory role in helping to strengthen our regional food system on a whole. And so I really think like one of the key elements of you know, what Christine and Kate are both talking about in the relationship with food access partners is just helping to strengthen the relationship that they have with their own local farmers in a way that feels more mutually beneficial to both parties. And so that they can, you know, break off and start to fundraise on their own accord in order to purchase regional foods, rather than just relying on donations from farms or whatever fresh foods they can get from their regional food bank. And unfortunately, in New York, our regional food bank isn't as progressed as some other states' regional food bank systems, and meaning that they don't source as much local food. They still have local food, certainly, but a lot of the produce that food access partners receive is coming from excess on the grocery store side. So I think, like, just helping to form relationships with smaller access organizations and then codify relationships with larger food access organizations to farms is really, what this program does well. And I do also want to mention, folks that are asking how they can get involved. I know right now the program exists in New York State, but, partners at Glynwood, and I'm kind of helping in the effort, are investigating ways to replicate the Food Sovereignty Fund and create more of a community of practice surrounding it so that it can exist in other places. And I know Kate's going to share some of those materials, but almost kind of, offering a toolkit as to how to start a Food Sovereignty Fund in your area, in your community, so that you make the accountability council, you pick the food access partners, you can even pick, the mission that it's kind of driving towards. So right now, the Food Sovereignty Fund is helping to promote BIPOC, LGBTQ+ women-led farms. But, that can be based on, what kinds of marginalized groups exist in your community that deserve, not to remain invisible.
Yeah, those are all really, really great points, Salem. And that did remind me as well that when we were building the Food Sovereignty Fund from the ground up, we did have conversations with other models elsewhere in the country that we saw as very inspiring and effective. And then in June 2021, we had a group call sort of to form a community of practice for growing food sovereignty. And so I'm guessing we have people from all over the place on this call, but for folks in the Midwest, the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities in Michigan is doing amazing work. We learned a lot from Hunger Free Colorado. Mainers Feeding Mainers is amazing. They have ultimately gotten state funding now in their annual budget to specifically keep Maine grown food in their state and pump it directly into food access programs. The Oregon Food Bank, the list goes on. So if any of you want some of those names based on your region, we'd be happy to be in touch about that. Could you include this list of other organizations in the chat? I will try my best. I'm not sure if the copy and paste from a spreadsheet is going to be flawless, but we can try. Or in a follow-up email as well. And just one point, so Christine and Salem both talked about food access partners within the Food Sovereignty Fund that sort of trickle that food to other entities as well. But I did want to mention that we have some relationships that is just one farm, one food access partner, and they distribute right out of that site. So a couple months ago, several people working in the Food Sovereignty Fund went to New York City to tour some of those food access partners in the Bronx and in Brooklyn. And we spent a good amount of the afternoon in Sunset Park and went to, for instance, a church called Church of the Good Shepherd. And they have in particular been seeing a huge influx of need with the migration crisis from Latin America. And we've partnered them specifically with a Mexican American owned farm. And I think they had a pre-existing relationship and they were just talking about how essential that partnership has been during the pandemic, of course, but also during this migration crisis where they're seeing an increased need for people to stay overnight in the church. They're one of those organizations that's doing a little bit of everything and incorporated food access into their work. And is really benefiting from this relationship. So I got another question from Piper. So has any of the recent local food purchasing assistance programs through the USDA assisted with food access at these hubs? And more broadly, how do you manage the ebbs and flows of funding streams for local food access? Great question. And that is a really scary thing for a lot of food access programs that are worried that funding, went sky high during the pandemic, but is now kind of drying up. So I can certainly speak to how some of that funding has worked. So in 2020, we got our funding through a variety of ways. We had a big fundraising campaign that was facilitated by Glynwood, where we were asking private donors or individuals in our community to give money to specifically build farm contracts. We also applied to several small grants through community foundations within Dutchess County of New York, Putnam County of New York, who were looking to help their immediate communities in any way they could. And those were essential in getting this program going. We did apply for the CFAP grant in 2020, that food box grant that everyone was looking forward to. We were not awarded it. And obviously that program ultimately had a lot of flaws. So we had to look elsewhere for funding. But we did learn a lot while we were writing that grant. And it helped us sort of distill what we wanted our program to look like. As I mentioned, through storytelling in our first season, Episcopal Charities of New York found out about our work. They were already hoping to do a similar program, channeling more local food into their church pantry systems. And so we built an agreement with them, and that has been going strong for 2 years now. Several of the food pantries that we visited in New York City are affiliated with Episcopal Charities of New York. So I just wanted to really hit home that storytelling is essential, that we have a hashtag, Food Sovereignty Fund, that we ask food access partners and participating farms to use so that we can find those posts and amplify them on Glynwood's channels. And we want this to be a bountiful project that, as we said, is replicable too. And so we want people to hear about it and ask us questions and see how we can help. Along those lines as well, we hired professional photographers to document some of this work, both distribution at food access programs and harvest at farms, and documentation of for accountability council members visiting some of those farms, so that would add to the storytelling, because whether we like it or not, pretty photos are essential to getting the point across these days on Instagram. And yeah, we were pitching and talking to as many people as we could. Then in 2021, we made a big USDA grant application specifically for the formation of these food hubs. The refrigerated trailers originally planted at 3 different hubs in the region that would ultimately be sent to 3 other food access partners, and then permanent cold storage units built at the original 3 locations. We once again did not get that USDA grant, and we were pretty devastated. It was a big ask, and my colleagues, Megan and Michelle in particular, put an incredible amount of work into that application. But the silver lining here is that we were eventually put in contact with a foundation that was interested in funding this work. And we already had that proposal and that very well-defined budget. And they said, we'll do it. We will fund this entire grant proposal, because obviously you've put the work in, you have the wheels on the road, so let's get this thing going. So that was a really fortunate thing. But yeah, inflation is disrupting the philanthropic cycle right now. It's really hard to know like what future funding would look like. And my colleague Megan and I were just talking the other day about like what it would be like to try to launch this project now, as opposed to 2.5 years ago. Because 2.5 years ago, everyone was talking about community need. And we still had to work at it to get money, but it was ultimately very successful. But I think that it is a bit harder right now. Do you have anything to add in terms of either philanthropy or programs like Nourish New York, Christine or Salem?
I mean, I agree with everything you just said, Kate. And I think it is kind of, serendipitous that the foundation came in and kind of rescued the application that y'all worked so hard on. But as far as, the connection, so Nourish New York is a program that was established in New York State by our former governor. And what it did was help to recover food that was going to waste on farms because their markets were no longer, viable during COVID, and get it into the hands of the food access organizations. And through that program, they invested a large amount of money directly to food access organizations to purchase food from these farms that they identified as, meeting that criteria, that they were New York State, making products that could benefit communities, and that they were losing a percentage of revenue, because of the pandemic. That being said, I think as the state had successfully benefited from Nourish New York, that money now has been codified in the New York State budget. So it's no longer, identified as this is Nourish New York. Now it's identified as this is money that's meant to go directly to food access organizations to purchase regional foods. Now, if you're familiar with how the budget of New York State or any other state is built, a lot of the times this money kind of goes through a metamorphosis, the use of the money. I think what the Food Sovereignty Fund has done has opened the door, opened the channel to say to the New York State government and the legislators, okay, you've done the first step. Now, the next step is really identifying farmers in need, farmers that have historically been marginalized, such as BIPOC, LGBTQ+ women-owned farms, and ensuring that those revenue dollars are going to them as a form of reparations of sorts. And I know that these conversations are happening. They've already been happening between partners that established a Nourish New York program and the Food Sovereignty Fund, as well as other partners in the state that are trying to do farm-to-food pantry efforts on their own. But I think that, naturally, a program like the Food Sovereignty Fund should be funded by government funds, whether it is at the state level, whether it's at the national level, or whether it's at your local community level. And one of the trends that we saw, through the pandemic was that a lot of municipalities receiving funds through, COVID emergency relief or American Rescue Plan are dedicating money to food security and dedicating money to, regional food availability and agriculture. And so with that, I think for me, if I were a legislator, a natural fit would be to fund a program like the Food Sovereignty Fund in my community to ensure that I'm, creating viability in the food system. And so while, it's great to rely on philanthropic dollars, I don't think it's as sustainable. And this is coming from a former fundraiser. I think really, to ensure that it is a community fund that's funding these programs, and that will come with a societal shift as to like, where are we placing value in our budgetary dollars? How are community members advocating for our dollars to be spent? But I do think that Nourish New York is going to help us push the lever in that direction, and will eventually impact and value the Food Sovereignty Fund and other programs that exist like it.
I want to add some emphasis here. If the state is going to fund these programs to support the farmers, it's important that they are funding the programs and not requiring the farmers to ever have to touch the state. The accessing state funds and federal funds can be so laborious that the only farms that will benefit from those funds will be the largest conglomerate farms that have staff to manage that. So it's important that the funds go into programs that are on the ground and they have oversight over how the funds are dispersed, like over the process for the farmers to apply or to be on the list to receive, and oversight over actually distributing the money. The model that the Food Sovereignty Fund uses is the most beneficial model for the farmers. They get the money for their contract upfront. They don't have to do any dancing around for it. There is the contingency fund that we now have built in, so that if a farm is paid $5,000 for produce and something happens, they don't end up like out of compliance for something that was beyond their control. So it's really only worth it if the funds go through organizations that are on the ground. I wanted to speak to something from the previous question about the hubs. As folks are looking to replicate this program or create their own programs, I think that the decision around whether you use a hub that distributes to feeding programs or you connect directly with farmers is very dependent on who your feeding programs are. We have a mixture, and I think that for the feeding programs that end up getting produce from our core, it's really important to have that hub, largely because of the size and the flexibility and being able to like shift food from one place to another, depending on like if the pantry is closed or if they're down staff or whatever. It works well for the programs that are on the receiving end of the food that comes through our core. And then there are other relationships where that direct farmer to feeding program connection it works very well. And then they get the benefit also of building relationship with the farmers. So the only thing that I would add or adjust about how food comes through the hubs, the way we do it, is that farmer connection isn't really there. And figuring out a way of connecting some of those smaller feeding programs to the farmers so that, maybe they can aspire to do some fundraising or find some other way of patronizing those farmers for the programs themselves. There is another question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, I can read it aloud. How do you organize/prioritize which food access partners get food? As we've grown to over 250 partners that get food, we are looking to find a way to be more intentional about how we prioritize where food goes based on unique needs of each partner. Do you have a way that you are organizing? That's a really good question. And yeah, something that we have talked about at length, how to determine which farm gets which contract size and how much of that contract goes to food access partner 1 versus food access partner 2, because some farms are distributing to multiple food access partners. So I already mentioned 2 ways in which we're organizing or identifying food access partners. One is that off the bat, within our accountability council, we had representation from several key food access partners or food access hubs in the region. And it was sort of a no-brainer to start there, start at the larger organizations who were seeing an incredible amount of need and were channeling that food to multiple entities within their communities. And also with the Episcopal Charities funding, they give a certain amount every year, and that funding has to go specifically towards contracts that pair regional farms with Episcopal Charity of New York affiliated food pantries. And so that's already accounted for. And we do some relationship building or pairing work with ECNY to make sure it's a good fit. So for instance, we have a farm called Choi Division that specializes in East Asian vegetables, and they're paired with a food pantry in Manhattan that is largely serving Asian American elders. And so we make sure that it's a good fit, that it is advancing our mission of food sovereignty and dignity and cultural appropriateness. But those are two ways that we're coming to identify food access partners. But if Christine and Salem have anything to add, I think that as I mentioned previously, the primary recruitment that we do is for farms. It's the farms who apply to the program, and then if they have an existing relationship with a food access partner that they want to maintain, we'll support that. If they don't, then we'll help them find another good relationship, either out of geographic convenience or cultural appropriateness, trying to find one that aligns well with the food that they're growing and also the volume that they're growing, the size of the contract that they want and the volume of food that food access partner is able to distribute. Because for some farms, for instance, we have one farm that is growing at such a large scale that their contract annually is $20,000. So they need a really huge food access partner or multiple partners in order to fulfill that contract. We have other very small, more like intensive vegetable operations that started off in year one with a $1,000 contract, and $5,000 is the absolute max is what they want to do. And so that's with a smaller pantry that might be distributing one time a week. Anything to add, Salem or Christine?
So for us as the hub, our feeding programs are essentially places that were known to our core, both to myself and to the students who were involved. So we did a round of funding and distribution without really getting much input from the kids. It was a small amount of money and it went really well, and we decided that we wanted to dive into this program. We had to get funding elsewhere in order to do it for that first year. But what we did was ask the kids, what are the places that you know that give out food? Who's doing it right? Have your families gone to any food pantries? And just kind of got information from them on what they saw happening. And then I reached out to those places and was able to establish some relationship there, if for the ones I didn't have a relationship with already. And essentially anyone who came to us, came across the radar and responded favorably or whatever, was kind of added to the list. And it was just a matter of, okay, we need to be able to get more food to get to these people. Over time, food access programs have actually gone away, either dissolved or moved out of our area, and left us with a smaller number of programs, but those programs get lots of food that they're able to distribute. I also ideally would like to ensure that we're supporting programs that distribute in the right ways. Dignity is important, and not wasting food is important. So we actually have folks go through the feeding programs, go through the line as a patron to see what the process is. How are you treated? What do you get? Are the things that you receive given with thought? Like, do they assemble to make a complete meal? How many meals do they make? How much food is it that you receive? Is it enough to get you through the week? And it's important to support those programs that are doing it right.
Great, thank you for that, Christine. Yeah, I think one thing that came to mind as you were speaking to that, Christine, is yeah, there's no perfect way. We've had a lot of conversations on how to allocate funding, how to find the right amount for contracts, and we don't necessarily go for equality in which each farm is getting the same amount of funding. We rather go for equity. What the farm, you know, in their letter of interest, they indicate what size of contract they would ideally like to fulfill. And we want it to be reflective of, you know, their total annual revenue. We don't want to go above a certain percentage of a farm's total annual revenue because we want them to still have a diversity of marketing channels and revenue streams. Because who knows, funding can always dry up. We don't want to be the sole source of income for any farm, and we allocate funding based on that. And as I mentioned previously, we also have our rainy day fund, which is helpful for crop failures, but also farms sometimes get behind on invoicing and accidentally distribute more food than was in their original contract. And we like to honor that as much as we can. And this year we didn't end up needing all of that rainy day funds, so we had extra, and during an accountability council meeting we met and talked about how we could fairly distribute this funding, like who had already fulfilled their contract, who had already reached out to see if we had more funding because they had a great crop and wanted to send more to the pantry. So it's an ongoing process, and we just try to make the decision-making as collective and democratic as possible. So we have only 4 minutes left. So I wanted to go ahead and put a Google folder in the chat box. This has some of the resources that we were talking about previously. So we wanted to go ahead and show you some of the draft and template documents that we've used in the past 3 seasons to structure the Food Sovereignty Fund. You'll see both a draft MOU or Memorandum of Understanding that we have all of our farms sign. We also have a template Food Sovereignty Fund SOP or Standard Operating Procedure for drop off at the food access partner. And we really want to instill that official documentation of the agreement is really helpful, and walking through every single step to make sure that the agreement between the Food Sovereignty Fund as a program and individual farms and food access partners makes sense, but then also the SOP between the food access partners and the farms, that they have an agreement of when the food is coming, in what form, etc. I also put in a farm asset map. So this is helpful. You know, we've spoken a lot about the various resources and skills that different entities have within our food system. And for instance, Glynwood has a lot of people who have a lot of experience applying for federal grants. So it makes sense for us to apply for those grants. We also have 501c3 status, and then can disseminate that funding to farms. So that's one of our key assets, but then also keeping in mind what are the assets of other local institutions, other citizen groups, and gifts of individuals that can further strengthen programs like these that are trying to serve an entire community. You'll also see a PDF that is a language justice guide that was created by another Hudson Valley organization called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. So we've worked with them a lot, as well as a group called the Hudson Valley Language Justice Collective, to provide simultaneous interpretation at events, whether in person or virtual, and also translate a lot of our documents. So you'll see that Our MOU and SOP templates are bilingual, as well as our amendment to MOU. So that's when we adjust a contract for one reason or another. And there's one other document in there, which is a sample of our record keeping. So we want to measure the impact of this work. So one of my key jobs within the Food Sovereignty Fund is I log every single invoice from every single farm into one spreadsheet. So we can keep track of where the food is going, make sure that the contracts are fulfilled, and also measure the total amount of food that's being distributed, both in total units, total pounds, and total value. And that's essential to storytelling. And we're also interested in seeing what percentage of food is green vegetables versus meat versus dairy, because at least nerds like me who love spreadsheets love being able to make a chart that shows that story. So I know that we're out of time, but just wanted to say thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great weekend, and I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat again. Salem and Christine, feel free to do the same. We want to see food sovereignty as a bigger presence in all of your communities, so want to help you get there.
Thank you all so much for your time and your knowledge sharing and your resource sharing today. I so appreciated this conversation, and it's exciting to see different organizations doing this important work across the country. I will also offer that we're moving into a break right now, but tomorrow there will be a community room at 1 p.m. Central Time focused on food sovereignty and mutual aid if folks are interested in continuing that conversation. So check out the WHOVA agenda page to put that on your calendar. But thank you all so much for joining us in this afternoon and sticking out a Friday afternoon wherever you are. We so appreciate you all sharing. So take care, Kate, Salem, and Christine. Thanks for being here.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys soon.